Modern nutrition science began about a century ago in the context of nutrient deficiency diseases. So there were editorials with titles like Sugar as Food, heralding sugar as one of the cheapest sources of calories for a mere 6 cents. You could buy 3,000 calories. What a bargain! But the nutrient deficiency era gave way to the dietary excess era. No longer were we dying of nutrient deficiency diseases like scurvy as much as we were dying from nutrient excess diseases like obesity and heart disease. So it became more about avoiding too many calories, too much saturated fat, too much sugar, too much sodium, but either way, still focused on nutrients. This allowed food companies to get away with abominations like frosting-filled cereal because it was fortified with 12 vitamins and minerals, 50% better than the measly 8 in Marshmallow Froot Loops. However, food, not nutrients, is the fundamental unit in nutrition, and to their credit, the field of nutrition started moving towards a more holistic view. So, first-generation dietary guidelines emphasized individual nutrients, moved on to second-generation food-based dietary guidelines, which largely converged on encouraging diets rich in what? Vegetables, fruits, legumes, your beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, whole grains, and nuts. But an area of emerging importance was the degree of food processing. What if, when it comes to nutrition and health, it's not so much the food or the nutrients as much as the level of processing? For instance, a food-based dietary guideline might say something like, eat more vegetable soup. Great! But there's vegetable soup and then there's vegetable soup. Are we talking a clean out the fridge kind of vegetable soup? A health haloed quinoa and kale organic with a heart-stopping 1,200 milligrams of sodium? How about a vegetable soup with more salt than there are vegetables? Or a vegetable flavor soup that has more artificial colors and MSG than it has vegetables. Right? All soup is not the same. The degree of processing matters. Ultra-processed foods are these industrial formulations which, besides salt, sugar, oils, and fats, include substances that are really not used in cooking, like added flavors and colors and artificial sweeteners, emulsifiers, other additives used to kind of imitate real foods, like frosted grape Pop-Tart with more grapes on the front of the package than are actually in it, with less grapes than there are salt in the, but look, it may artificially taste like grapes and look like grapes because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different food dyes. Simply put, ultra-processed foods are foods that can't be made in a home kitchen because they've been chemically or physically transformed in these industrial processes. They typically contain little or no whole foods, are ready to consume and heat up, and are, fatty, salty, or sugary, and depleted in dietary fiber and other nutrients. So it's like all the, sweet and fatty, salty snacks like potato chips and ice cream and soda candy, French fries, burgers, hot dogs, chicken nuggets, fish sticks, basically everything in a box or a bag. Why not just call them, packaged foods? Well, they were actually thinking about it, but they were afraid that some consumers might look at a bag of apples or something and be like, get confused or something. Okay, but what is so revolutionary about this concept of ultra-processed foods? I mean, wasn't fatty, salty, sugary junk always a bad idea? Why isn't enough? Why is it not enough to just tell people to stay away from junk? Because Diet Coke. Diet soda is the perfect example why a new kind of term like ultra-processed can be so useful. Because it has no calories, no fat, no sugar, so no problem, right? Well, then why is diet soda consumption associated with premature death, stroke, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, leukemia? And most studies controlled for body weight, so it's not just because heavier people are more likely to drink it. Health risks are not only related to the nutritional quality of ultra-processed foods, but also to the presence of additives, right? So no apparent calories, fat, sugar, salt, but contains caramel color, which results in the formation of 4-methylamidazole, which is a potential human carcinogen, and contains aspartame, also recently classified as possibly cancer-causing in humans, and contains phosphoric acid, which is a phosphate additive that may be damaging our health as well, and contains a benzoate preservative. Right? If you remove artificial colorings and benzoate preservatives from the diets of preschoolers and then randomize them to be slipped a placebo or a hidden cocktail of colors and benzoate, there's a significant reduction in hyperactive behavior when they got to remove these compounds, and then a significant increase in hyperactive behavior when they got the colorings and benzoate compared to getting the placebo. Now, of course, it could have been the colors and not the benzoate, but that's one of the problems. As little as we know about the effects of these individual additives, right, we know even less about what combinations of them can do. There's a large body of evidence suggesting toxicity from certain food colors, preservatives, sweeteners, and emulsifiers, in part sometimes through our gut microbiome. Now, industry apologists argue that the Food and Drug Administration carefully evaluates food additives to make sure that they're safe, of course, until they're not. In fact, to show the system works, they cite the removal of 6 carcinogenic artificial flavors in 2018. Artificial flavors that had been in the food supply approved for safety since 1964. So we were exposed for more than 50 years before they were banned, and that's their example of the system working. Now, okay, if additives are the problem, well then, why not just stick to so-called clean label foods made with simple, recognizable ingredients, no matter how the food is processed? Now, but that's assuming additives are the only other reason that ultra-processed foods may be unhealthy. Harmful additives are just one of the many ways ultra-processed foods have been linked to disease. Right? I mean, at least the food additives are listed on the label, so we could avoid them if we wanted to. Unlisted are some of the sneakier ways ultra-processed foods may be unhealthy. Harmful additives are just one of the ways that ultra-processed foods have been linked to disease, like advanced glycation end products, for example. Increasing evidence has shown that the uptake of dietary AGEs, advanced glycation end products, closely related to the occurrence of many chronic diseases, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's disease. In fact, it is hard to find a single age-related disease not associated with AGEs. Dietary AGEs are abundant in highly processed foods because thermal treatments are commonly used. But, thermal treatment just means heat. So look, we can get AGEs from industrial processing or just from home cooking. So let's look at some examples. Canned corn has 20 units of AGEs per serving, compared to corn chips at 151, corn pops cereal 373. Right? Rice only has 9, but Rice Crackers 275 and Rice Krispies has 600. So you might be at the store and see some no salt added rice cracker or some no sugar added puffed rice cereal and be like, oh, great, right? This is just straight rice. Perfect. One ingredient. Right? But no, because of the processing, it's not just that one ingredient. Boiled potato, 17 per serving. Potato chips, 865. Fast food fries, over 1,500. So ultra-processed plant foods can have nearly 100 times more of these toxins than minimally processed plant foods. But even raw, unprocessed animal foods start out with high levels and just go up from there. Instead of the 10 or 20 in cooked whole plant foods, fish, poultry, and meat start out at around 500 or more in their raw state, and then jump into the thousands once cooked, which is still considered minimal processing, though processed or ultra-processed meat can exceed 10,000 per serving. Are plant-based alternatives healthier than conventional animal products? Let's find out. Food Compass is a nutrient profiling system that rates foods on a scale from 1 to 100, with 1 being least healthy, 100 being most healthy. 8,000 foods have been scored, so you can see where your favorite food falls. And when I have my laptop next to me, I ask people to yell out their favorite food, and we look up, see what the score is, and they're all disappointed that their raspberry is only like a 93 or something, like, oh, whatever. But unfortunately, the laptop's in the back. But here are some examples of some perfect 100 foods, as well as foods that score the worst, all the way down from kale to Coca-Cola. Okay, So the main objective of ultra-processed fake foods is to imitate real foods, like strawberry Pop-Tarts trying to imitate real strawberries. Well, when you start out with a perfect 100 food like strawberries, the only way to go is down. So, fruit is better than fruity-shaped marshmallows. But when the real food is ultra-processed meat, processed meat, or unprocessed meat or dairy, there's lots of room for improvement. So Food Compass has scored 9 ultra-processed meatless alternatives. Let's compare them to their closest conventional meat matches, and in every single case, plant-based meat was rated higher, healthier, sometimes by a large margin. Nearly all scored at least twice as high, or 3 times the health score, 7 times, 20 times, even 60-fold higher. Other common nutrient scoring systems all found the same general trend. Now, look, better than chicken would be chickpeas, and better soybeans than soy burgers. Soybeans are another perfect 100 food. But the choice on the Burger King menu is between this and that, not between this and that. Though, of course, there is a third choice, not ending up at Burger King. When it comes to heart disease, stroke, and cancer, plant-based meats be expected to decrease risk of these killer diseases by about 3% per daily serving replacement. Now, whole soy foods might take that down an extra 2% because they're not weighed down by the sodium issue. But overall, swapping in even just one serving of plant-based meat a day nationwide could potentially prevent more than 100,000 cases of heart disease, stroke, or cancer in the U.S. every year. Right? It's hard to get everyone to go all kale and quinoa overnight, but a veggie burger, right, should be easy. Right? When you compare ultra-processed products to the foods they were designed to replace, for example, water versus Kool-Aid, or fruit versus fruit-flavored candy, right? The ultra-processed product tends to do worse, and not just because of the junkier nutrient profile. However, plant-based meats appear to be the exception. Better in most ways compared to the foods they were designed to replace. The most harmful additive in plant-based meat is, ironically, really the most traditional, and that's salt. Contributing to the number one dietary risk factor for death on planet Earth, excess sodium consumption. It is one of the most common ingredients in plant-based meat alternatives. Of course, also one of the most frequently used ingredients in conventional meat processing, and not just processed meat. While the number one source of sodium for kids in this country is pizza, and for older adults, bread, one of the reasons the number one source of sodium for those aged 19 through 50 in this country is chicken is because injecting raw chicken with salt water is a widespread practice in the poultry industry, something they've been doing since the 1970s, resulting in raw chicken breasts reaching as much as 400 milligrams of sodium or more, 6 times more than what they naturally have. In response to a Super Bowl ad placed by a meat industry-funded lobbying group questioning plant-based meat for its hard-to-spell ingredients, Impossible Foods responded with a parody, questioning an unintentional additive in conventional meat. Fecal contamination of the carcass in the slaughter plant is considered unavoidable. And though there are methods for removing kind of visible fecal contamination on meat, and even experimental imaging technologies designed to detect more kind of diluted fecal contaminations, we're still left at a retail level with guess what proportion of meat contaminated with fecal bacteria at the grocery store. About 85% of ground beef and turkey contaminated with fecal bacteria, and about half of chicken on store shelves, and a third of pork found contaminated with enterococci, which is used as a marker of fecal contamination in food. Plant-based meat is better than animal-based meat in about 40 different ways. Now, obviously, some of these categories are more important than others. The fact that bacon is officially designated as cancer-causing is more important than the fact that it may have, a few more calories than plant-based bacon. But cancer is just killer number 2. The leading cause of death of men and women is heart disease. And hidden into that nutrient profile are the 3 things that raise LDL cholesterol: saturated fat, trans fat, and dietary cholesterol. Yes, there are other factors like TMAO, sodium, but LDL cholesterol, known as bad cholesterol, unequivocally recognized as the principal driver of atherosclerotic heart disease, our leading cause of death. Basically, we should try to get our LDL as low as possible. When it comes to LDL lowering, for the prevention of heart disease, lower for longer is better, even if your LDL is quote-unquote normal. Even if other heart disease risk factors are considered optimal, still of utmost importance to control. So, if LDL is the primary driver of our primary killer, if you could just know one thing about a food, if you could just ask one question, it would be, wait a second, what does this food do to my LDL cholesterol? So we're looking at nutrition labels for saturated fat, trans fat, and cholesterol, since any intake above 0 increases LDL cholesterol and therefore increases our risk of coronary heart disease. In terms of saturated fat and cholesterol, animal meats are the main source in the American diet. And with the removal of partially hydrogenated oils in the U.S. food supply, such that these other sources are now banned, animal products are now the leading source of trans fats as well, since meat and dairy can naturally contain trans fats. Diets high in processed meat and red meat are also the two leading causes of diet-related disability. The United States is responsible for more than 1 million years lived in disability annually, 3 times more than diets high in sugar-sweetened beverages, for example. And more than 2 million years of healthy life lost. Based on the most comprehensive analysis of risk factors and disability in history, millions of years of life lost in the United States because people are eating diets high in red and processed meat. Okay, yeah, but what do they define as high, though? A diet high in processed meat is defined as any intake of processed meat. And a diet high in red meat, high as in any intake of red meat. So millions of years of life lost in the United States because people are eating more than 0 red and processed meat. The only categories of ultra-processed foods associated with higher mortality were sweetened beverages and meat. So wait, if the only ultra-processed food that appears to be killing people is meat, then in that case, instead of being part of the problem, plant-based meat may be the solution to the ultra-processed problem, right? Let me say that again. Instead of being part of the problem, plant-based meats may be the solution to the ultra-processed problem. The most important question in all nutrition may be, compared to what, right? The effects of any given food depend on what that food is being compared against. So is plant-based meat healthy? Well, compared to the animal products it's intended to replace, absolutely, right? Plant-based meat alternatives are more healthful than the meat they replace, but perhaps less so than the whole plant foods such as legumes and whole grains. Wait, just perhaps less so? This is how ultra-processed plant meat compares to meat. This is how unprocessed plants compare to meat. Not only making up for all the shortfalls, but if we add an even better category, whole plant foods do even better in many categories. For example, bean-based meat averages 5 times less saturated fat than their meat comparators, but actual beans have 40 times less. Okay? Half the trans fat or no trans fat. 5 grams of fiber, certainly better than 0, but hey, 9 grams is even better. And there are interventional trials demonstrating the greater benefits, for example, in terms of fighting insulin resistance and inflammation. So certainly whole plant foods for the win, but plant-based meat alternatives, they're not designed to replace whole plant foods. Instead, to offer a stepping stone in the transition away from meat. I like to think of it as like meat methadone, right? Or as Professor Gardner put it, right, hoping that plant-based meats will be the gateway drug to legumes, right? This is how the transition to healthier diets is envisioned, from the global burden of disease to the global relief of disease, as people use plant-based and mycoprotein-based meats to transition towards a more whole food plant-based diet. With the added saturated fat and sodium, plant-based meats are not healthy, but they are healthier. They are healthier than the foods they were designed to replace. They are better, but not the best. Yes, nutrition policies and dietary guidelines, the bottom line, they should continue to emphasize diets rich in whole plant foods. Indeed, if all meat and high-income countries were replaced with whole legumes, we could potentially decrease the overall mortality rates by 5 or 6%. That means saving 180,000 lives in the United States every year. If instead we replaced meat with processed or ultra-processed plants, we'd only save about 130,000 Americans every year, about a 4% drop in overall mortality, right? That's still over 100,000 people saved every year, right? So we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Plant-based meat alternatives are better than the alternative, or as one study put it, plant-based meat can be considered meat with benefits. Thank you so much.